Hey everyone, this is Dr. Melanie. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be discussing some unconventional topics. Hopefully you will come away with some new ideas and you'll learn something new. But today I'm really excited. I have with me Sohail Shakeri, and he is a Harvard-trained philosopher, author, lecturer, and business consultant. He has written articles on mythology, religious movements, and the nature of education. He has taught humanities, philosophy, and religion at both the college and university level. His main interests lie in questioning the mainstream cultural narrative from a foundation of love and consciousness. Sohail's first book is about the crisis of our dying global civilization and is due out in the fall of 2020 by Universal Publishers. For more information about Sohail's work, you can find him on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the name The Social Critic. Hey Sohail, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Melanie. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your story and how you kind of began researching these unconventional topics.
Sure. Yeah. So I think for me, it started really growing up. So growing up here in the States, so my parents immigrated to the States from Iran. And, growing up, I would visit Iran like every 3, 4 years to visit grandparents, aunts, and uncles. And then I noticed that the climate here, like in school and on the news and everything, was very hostile towards people of Iranian background. And I was like, gosh, what is all this about? And then and I would go to visit like family, and I would just be like showered with like love and kindness and just cooking and good food and visiting and singing and dancing. And I was just like, and I would watch the news here and I'd see what people's perceptions were here. It's like, gosh, why are these so different? Why is the perception so different from what I'm experiencing? And so really that led me to start to research about the media, in different, how they present different things, and whether there was, any particular interest, business or otherwise, that was driving the narrative, and just seeing, gosh, how much that hurt the ability for different people of different cultures to connect to one another, because we were getting these perceptions from the media. So that was really my first start of taking a step back and questioning some common mainstream narratives.
I love that. So you began questioning, you began digging, and what did you uncover about the Rockefeller Foundation and their connection with our educational system?
Sure, yeah. So studying about, the media, took me, down, some rabbit holes. And one of those, discoveries, from my studies was the link of, the Rockefeller Foundation to public education, to academics, and what is shaping our educational foundation. So I studied, as you mentioned, the Rockefellers, and how in late 1800s or in early 1900s, John D. Rockefeller was, the wealthiest man, in the U.S. And in fact, he was the first billionaire. And I saw that his interests, based off of his foundation of his company, his Standard Oil Company, which has then branched into ExxonMobil and some of the other prominent oil companies, is that he took that foundation in oil and wanted those interests to be influential in other areas, including education, and one aspect of that also being medicine. And so so his foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, started to fund the National Education Endowment, the NEA, also leveraging the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation to shape the education around domestic issues in the U.S. as well as international issues. And so one of the driving factors, as I mentioned, was related to wanting to see his financial interests be reflected and have a strong benefit from the mainstream educational model. And so education got steered into creating people to be good corporate workers, good workers for the corporation, as opposed to the critical thinking and a more experiential approach and understanding of education that would actually benefit the student, that would benefit the child. So it was focused more on learning up here and being able to memorize certain facts, as opposed to really getting an experience of a topic, to really have a palpable feel for that topic, to really have it be ingrained in our being. So they wanted people to learn to memorize, focus on different technologies, whether that's from 100 years ago or the technology of the times today, and more focused on creating a scientific left brain technicians, as opposed to a more right brain creative aspect that could infuse some of our left brain analytical thinking. They just wanted us to be focused more heads down on being able to regurgitate certain information, and that so that we don't really rock the boat, we don't ask big critical questions, and that we just do what we're told. We get our salaries, some more than others, depending on the task that's being asked, and we just accept things as they are and go about our business so they can gain more and more power. And this was done surreptitiously or secretively through the foundations. So people always think, oh, foundations, oh my goodness, what a wonderful idea. Oh, people are being so generous and such wonderful philanthropists. But what part of my studies also uncovered was that these foundations are used by wealthy billionaires in order to influence public policy, in order to provide a specific direction on different industries or education, medicine, and what have you.
So Rockefeller's ideologies kind of infiltrated the educational system, and you mentioned it was very just much so in the line of memorizing, not so much critical thinking. So bring us up to today into this current COVID climate. How has that affected us?
Sure. Yeah. So that model continued, and so you had the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ford Foundation. Both of these are huge influencers of education, in the U.S., and they were working hand in hand with the Rockefeller Foundation, and so that continued into the early 2000s, where under the presidency of George W. Bush, you had the No Child Left Behind Act get implemented. And so it sounds great, on the surface. Oh, wonderful, we don't want to leave children behind. That's beautiful. But what that put forth was a furthering of this Rockefeller educational model. So it was basically implementing the same policy, except at a more, basically turning up the volume, if you will. So ramping up that type of education, more standardized testing, more focus on memorization. And I don't know about you, but for me growing up, when I would, study for a test, I mean, I was, I guess, fortunate. I did well on those tests, but most times it's just in one ear. You know enough for the test, you pass the test, and then a day later, 2 days later, you totally forget about it.
Mhm.
And so it's not real learning. It's just more of short-term memory, memorization of facts. And so that educational model started in the early 2000s, with the No Child Left Behind. That was a continuation, and it's continued to our present day with the COVID crisis. So as far as how that ties into the COVID crisis, so that model that I referenced applies not just to public education, through high school, but it also is very influential in the universities as well. So in a lot of university, teaching and education, is based off of that same model, where what gets you the grade is being able to regurgitate the information, repeat what the professor said, maybe put it in your own words, but basically repeat what the professor said in order to get the grade. Or you need to study the facts and terms from the textbook and make sure that you're able to, spit out the right answer, if you will, in order to get the grade. And so it continued at the university level and also in the medical system. Okay. And so, in our society, we look at medical schools, and people who become doctors. A lot of times when we say so and so is a doctor, we mean an MD, allopathic, physician. And that just goes to show how this has pervaded our culture. And so even in the medical schools, if you talk to many medical students who've graduated, they'll say that, we are focused on cramming for the information, making sure that we memorize the facts and understand about different diseases, different pharmaceutical pills that we need to take for different diseases. And as you know better than me, the influence or the educational aspect with regards to nutrition is extremely low. In fact, I think they might have one semester of nutrition in all of medical school.
Mhm.
And so then you take that model that permeates our medical schools and also permeates our mainstream media, okay? Because a lot of times you'll see people who are board members of different corporations who own the mainstream media, whether it's NBC, Fox, ABC, CNN. So the people who are on these boards are oftentimes also on the boards of major pharmaceutical companies, like Merck, like Pfizer, like GlaxoSmithKline. And so these pharmaceutical companies are also the biggest funders of our medical schools. So they pay for the training for our medical doctors, and they pay for the marketing on TV of these different pharmaceutical pills that they are training these medical doctors to prescribe. And so with regards to COVID, so with this same model, you see all the hysteria, around, this virus, as they call it, and I should say as they call it because there's a debate in medicine, those who are looking at things at a deeper level about whether a virus and an exosome are essentially, one and the same. And so you'll see some prominent, physicians, virologists, also putting forth, this question. And so, so that mainstream approach with regards to the virus, creates the same type of hysteria in order to get people to be placed in this place of fear, right? Because that's what the mainstream media does. It creates fear in people to keep people contracted and to keep people vulnerable to being controlled by different authorities, whether that's the authority in the medical school, or whether it's the authority in on the television news, or your whoever it could be, a wealthy billionaire. It's to have people be falling in line. And so so even with regards to potential remedies for a virus, people are not exploring options to, well, gosh, how can I keep myself healthy? How can I strengthen my immune system? As better than me, how can I make sure that I am so healthy that whatever toxins I'm exposed to in my environment, I can handle them and deal with them, so we don't have this hysteria. So you don't have that approach. It's more focused on, there's this big virus, we should all be very afraid, and let's just do what we're told. And so what we're told is coming through the mainstream media, and that permeates public and oftentimes private education if it follows the same model. And it just influences our culture and our mode of operating. So it keeps people confined, and it prevents people from unleashing their creativity, living the best of the human spirit, and really living our potential as human beings.
I really like the way that you explain that, and how, this system has infiltrated our educational system. The media is connected, the medical field is connected, and then you've got people at home and they're not critically thinking. They're put in this position of fear, and then it's almost as if, because of the schooling, they just go along with whatever is repeated to them. They repeat it to everyone else, and it's almost as if the people watching the media almost become like little soldiers for this fear-based system. Would you agree?
So true. Oh, most definitely, most definitely. And so then what happens, as you mentioned, is we have these this self-policing culture that essentially censors one another, from people breaking out of the mold and wanting to take a step back and be, take a critical look at things, look at the big picture. Look at things creatively, see if there's any new ways that one can deal with the situation. And so you have these police, really, that are being created all throughout our culture, in order to keep people in line. And so that's the most yes, that's one of the most effective ways to keep people censored. So to have people censor each other, and then at an even deeper level, people censoring themselves. It's like, oh gosh, I can't say that. People have this creative, intuitive impulse. It's like, well, gosh, this doesn't sound right. Or I think this is a better approach to deal with this situation, whether it's COVID or anything permeating mainstream society, or like we have like the race riots, or whatever people is on people's minds, to look at things from a different perspective, then people have this impulse to say, oh no, I can't say that because that's wrong, because they know it goes against the mainstream narrative. And so we create this self-policing force that is very effective. And so yeah, so I think I think it's one of the main challenges of our society today.
So with regards to this branch of medicine, it does seem like there's this kind of hidden religion, and there's this cast of characters. Tell us a little about that.
Sure. Yeah. So going back to the influence of the Rockefeller Foundation. Okay, so they made their money in oil. Okay, so I mentioned the Standard Oil Company, which was then permeated into ExxonMobil and other prominent oil corporations. And so that's a petrochemical process, that oil extraction. Okay, and so one of the ways that the Rockefellers wanted to expand their control was to advocate for and fund a medical model that used their petrochemical oil in order to help create pharmaceuticals and to create remedies, quote unquote, for people when they're sick. So they say, gosh, this is a great opportunity to further our control over society. And so let's advocate for a pharmaceutical petrochemical model of medicine, which is essentially creating these artificial pills for people that that are based off of that that oil, that type of energy, and have it permeate in society. And so one of the main ways that they did this in the early 1900s was by having their key heads of the Rockefeller Foundation start to permeate the medical establishment. Okay, so in the early 1900s, you had probably around a third of US medical schools were naturopathic medical schools, and about a third were homeopathic medical schools. And then you had about a third or so of the allopathic model. But what the Rockefellers did was said, you know what, we're going to make sure that the only type of medical schools that get funding, government funding, are those that follow this allopathic petrochemical model. And so they did that through the AMA, which is still the dominant medical institution controlling medical education and medical research in the US, the American Medical Association. So, so there was a gentleman by the name of Abraham Flexner, who was the head of the Rockefeller Institute at the time in the early 1900s. And so he was able to influence policy to the point where, as I just mentioned, that all funding for medical schools would only go towards those that follow this allopathic model. So the naturopathic medical schools died out. The homeopathic medical schools died out. I mean, and I'm sure you could speak to this better, but I know there's some today, but it's not, these are private institutions that are trying to get up on their own, which is a much more difficult situation than you have with these publicly funded medical schools. So so they influenced it from that time, and it continues to this very day. That type of funding and approach has permeated the entire medical establishment in the US, to the point where that's what people understand to be medicine. So when I say this hidden religion that you referred to, it's an assumption of orthodoxy, where people it's just presumed that there's only one medical model, and that's the pharmaceutical pills. If you're sick, what's wrong? You have the sniffles? Take an aspirin, you'll feel better. What's wrong? You have the flu? Well, there's Tamiflu, just take some and you'll feel better, And this focus on the symptoms as opposed to this deeper integrative approach, which I know that you practice and others, in order to really heal the body from within, as opposed to putting a Band-Aid on symptoms that would also lead to other symptoms. So it's this religion in the sense that there's an orthodoxy where if anyone is different, anyone approaches things differently, they're branded as quacks. Okay, so you have a prominent website that is funded indirectly by the Rockefeller Foundation, called Quackwatch. And so anyone who wants to really tap into their creativity, take a look, from the big picture and say, wait a minute, there's another model here. This shouldn't be the only way that we approach this. They're deemed quacks. And that's just the medical term for a heretic or an unbeliever or an infidel. Okay, so you have the same in the history of religion, where people who had different approaches to religion were immediately deemed heretics. And you also see it in the political arena as well, where people who want to question the mainstream narrative, are you advocating a conspiracy theory? That's another term for heretic or unbeliever that people are shying away from.
Excellent. You explained that so well in the sense that they did silence any alternative view, any alternative perspective when it comes to natural health. And, you know, thankfully today there is more of an awareness. There are critical thinkers. There are people that are wanting to, instead of just unconsciously going along with a path, they're consciously questioning and thinking and critical thinking. And it's opened up, I think, actually more people to an alternative view, or to the fact that you can get to a root cause. You can discover why you have symptoms. And in alternative medicine and natural medicine, there's many paths. And what I like to say is that, you know, in someone's individual area, there is a practitioner for you, you know, and you're going to find someone and they're going to be able to help you, and it's going to fit exactly with what you've got going on. Instead of being so afraid, you know, it's, you know, just having that belief system that there is an answer, there is a way, and that you can come out of those symptoms. And so that kind of brings me up to our next question. You know, in this current climate, you know, with the lockdown, and certainly there were some negative things that occurred due to the lockdown, but I want you to talk about, you know, some potential positive things and some kind of some takeaways that we can have regarding the lockdown.
Definitely. Yeah, and this goes to your earlier point where you were talking about how with the suppression of views at a corporate or governmental level around medicine, it seems like it sparked almost more interest in people to want to explore other options. You know, as you pointed out, there's this flowering of different perspectives in health, which is amazing. And I think it's one of the gifts of our time that you see this greater awareness, this greater consciousness about how to create and maintain and sustain health. And with regards to the COVID lockdown, so I also feel like it's that same it's that same approach where while you have these measures to control society in place, you also have this flowering, and the flowering is showing itself by people really being forced to take a step back and say, oh gosh, you know, so now I can't go, or, you know, up until, you know, recently, I can't go to restaurants, you know, I can't go to the beach, you know, I can't go on hiking trails.
Mhm.
Gosh, what is this life all about? Like, what?
Yeah.
It's really forcing people to take a step back and say, you know, what's really important to me in life? You know, we're faced more with being around our loved ones, our families, and I think one of the I think ailments really of this fast-paced society is that we just get caught up in so like a million different things that we want to accomplish, and oftentimes they're great things, but it's like we neglect the wonderful things in front of us, you know, that are just so nourishing, you know, for our lives, you know, like our families, like if we have like a garden close by to our house, like for us, you know, I'm blessed to have a little garden at my house, and just spending time in my yard and just kind of watching, you know, sometimes even day by day, just some of these plants just grow and change, and just watching these like grapevines. It's amazing, like the intelligence behind some of these, just these natural plants. Like they'll like wrap around your finger and it's like, hey, get me off. And it's like a little child just like grabbing your finger, you know, and just appreciating, I think, the little things and taking the time to reflect, you know, maybe doing some journaling, maybe doing some meditation, you know, maybe just, you know, spending more time with the people who matter the most in our lives, and really taking a look and saying, gosh, how do I want to live my life now that I've had this time to reflect? Do I really want to go back into that mode of thinking where I was being influenced by, you know, this news narrative, this 24-hour news cycle, you know, or do I want to look at things differently? And so I think that that awareness is really rising. in people, more so than I've ever seen it. And so I think that's one of the great gifts, of this lockdown time.
Excellent. Those are some beautiful takeaways. And you know what, you guys, if you have questions or comments, I want to encourage you, leave your questions or comments below. Don't forget to follow Sohail at his social media, The Social Critic. Thank you for joining us, Sohail.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Melanie. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. You guys have a great day. And don't forget, leave us some comments or questions. Thanks for watching, you guys. Bye-bye.